Hill Rescue. James found life dull at the works. Having never been to one for a long stretch, he found it even more boring than other engines did. That, along with his worry about being useless to the Fat Controller, made James rather cranky. But when he was finally allowed out for a few tests on a siding, James felt a little better. Richard, who had done James's work as well as his own in his absence, was shunting well wagons onto a siding nearby, and whistled a greeting. "Good to see you out and about again," said Richard. James smiled, but Richard could see that not all was well with the red engine. "James, what's wrong?" asked Richard, moving to a closer siding to where James was. Nothing. Nothing at all," James snapped quickly, jerking backwards into a siding. "Steady, boy! Something the matter?" asked the man running the tests. James sighed, calming down, and muttered quietly, "There is nothing the matter with me." Richard frowned thoughtfully and watched James as he puffed slowly back into the works. The Fat Controller came to visit a few days later, after all the tests had been run and James was completely mended. "I want you to work at Egwood Station for a while," he told him. "I'm sure it'll be a great help to Egwood and Boko, and it'll give you a chance to stretch your wheels before getting back to your normal duties." James was surprised. "But sir, why can't I get back to my duties straight away?" The Fat Controller gave James a long look and said, "We're doing just fine without you, James. Besides, this rest will do you good. Now get going." He smiled and walked away. James got up a good head of steam quickly and was soon puffing leisurely down the main line to Egwood Station. Although he had been mended, he had a funny feeling in his smoke box, and he couldn't get the words out of his head. "We're doing just fine without you, James." James jerked from his thoughts as Egwood greeted him with a whoosh of steam and a friendly whistle. "Hello, James. I trust you're feeling much better. How do you feel about helping me with some shunting in the yard?" James said nothing. He puffed off, eyes downcast, leaving Egwood rather puzzled. James shunted some trucks into a line for a goods train, watching the various trains go past, miserably as they whistled James a welcome back. Richard eventually drew in with a heavy goods train. He stopped outside the station, breathless, so James could shunt some trucks from his train and added a few more. Richard was still worried about James, but thought it best just to whistle a feeble hello and ask for a banker. Egwood was already on the hill, so Richard puffed off with a good amount of noise and steam. He was well on to halfway up before Egwood buffered up to help, and the two engines set off up the steep incline. But Richard was struggling long before they reached the top. "Hello? We've got a steam leak somewhere. A big one," said the driver. Egwood began to feel the weight on his buffers becoming much heavier, just as Richard whistled that he wanted to stop. "What's wrong?" asked Egwood. "We've got a steam leak. Richard can't move light engine, let alone with the train. We need more help." Egwood reversed into the station and called for James. He had just finished a good lot of shunting and was dozing in the siding near the platform, dreaming of the first time he had ever pulled the express. James? James! Edward whistled loudly, and James woke with a start. James's fireman, who had just gone for a cup of tea whilst the driver held the fort, came outside to see what all the fuss was about. Richard has a bad steam leak. I need you to take Richard and the slow goods. What? Exclaimed James. Pull them both? I'm sure you can, smiled Edward knowingly. You're the strongest red engine I know, and I can help you on the hill. I'm sorry I can't help more, but I have work here. What do you say, James? Can you do it? James had his doubts. We're doing just fine without you, James. But instead of feeling sorry for himself, James snorted and said, Of course I can! I'm useful no matter what anyone thinks! And with that, James snorted away before Edward could get a word in. He just smiled and followed James to Gordon's Hill. Edward's driver jumped down and called ahead to warn them about the problem with Richard, and James pulling the train home, and then Edward buffered up behind the long train. Peep, peep, called Edward. I'm ready. Peep, 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 called James. Get moving, you! James almost gave up as both Edward and himself roared to get the long cavalcade moving. It seemed so heavy, and he was just one engine. My first express. And with that, the heavy train slunk forward with a groan. Go it, James! Go it! Yelled Richard, who was behind James. And with that, they found themselves at the top of the hill, where James felt just as strong and proud as ever he did. Edward whistled goodbye at the bottom of the hill, and James and Richard set off with the slow goods. It was hard going for James. He still had to stop at each station to pick up and set down trucks with Richard behind him to boot, so it was difficult stopping and starting. But as they approached the workstation, Richard whispered, Thank you for helping a friend in need, James. The splendid red engine. And don't I know it, chuckled James. He left the trucks, which were then taken by Edwin, and shunted Richard onto a siding. I hope you're mended soon, said James. I don't care how proud this makes me feel with your work as well as mine. I'm probably going to be pulling a few goods trains. Ugh, trucks! James puffed away, rather annoyed. That's the James I know, chuckled Richard. Just as proud and conceited as ever. And I'm sure all the engines on this railway wouldn't change him for the